In June 2012, a pastor facing exposure over an investment and bank fraud scheme involving more than $70 million sent out a 22-page confession. In it, he admitted to carrying out one of the largest bank fraud schemes in Georgia history. He also left behind a letter claiming that he planned to jump from a ferry and end his life. Then, he completely vanished. A court eventually declared him legally dead. 18 months later, a police officer in southern Georgia pulled over a vehicle because its window tint was too dark. Sitting behind the wheel was one of America's most wanted fraud fugitives, and during the time everyone believed he was dead, he had been growing and selling marijuana. This is the story of Aubrey Lee Price. Aubrey Lee Price was born around 1966 and came from southern Georgia, not far from the area where Montgomery Bank Trust, the bank that would later become central to his fraud case, was located. To the people around him, he was simply known as Lee. As a young man, Price chose religion as his first calling. In 1987, at around 20 years old, he enrolled at Bruton Parker College, a Baptist college in Mount Vernon, Georgia, where he studied religious ministry. It was there that he met his future wife, Rebecca. Price graduated in 1990 with a bachelor's degree in theology, and later continued his theological studies at Columbia International University. After completing his education, he became a Baptist pastor. Throughout the 1990s, faith remained at the center of his life. He married Rebecca and started a family. Price spent years in ministry, serving at several churches across Georgia, including Teeman Baptist Church in Griffin and later Clear Springs Baptist Church near Johns Creek. His work extended far beyond Sunday sermons. He became involved in church administration, fundraising, construction projects, and overseas mission work. One destination in particular became especially important to him, Venezuela. Price traveled there repeatedly, often leading groups on mission trips lasting around 2 weeks. They worked in local villages and helped with church construction projects. Eventually, Price and his family formalized those efforts by establishing a nonprofit organization called Global Discipleship Ministries, which supported missionary and community projects in Venezuela. Over time, Price began looking at investing as another way to fund his overseas missionary work. By the late 1990s, he had developed a serious interest in finance and had also operated small investment ventures with his father, Jim Price. Around 2000, Price decided to move into finance full-time, and the pastor began transforming himself into an investment professional. Over the next several years, Price built a legitimate resume in the financial industry. He worked for Bank of America Investment Services, Citigroup Global Markets under the Smith Barney brand, and later FSC Securities. He was no longer simply a pastor with an interest in investing. He was now a licensed financial professional with experience at major firms, but he never truly left his church network behind. Instead, his two worlds began to merge. Friends from church, people who had traveled with him on mission trips to Venezuela, and families who had known his wife and children for years gradually became his clients. Their trust wasn't built on investment performance alone, it had been built through years of personal relationships. In 2008, Price stopped working for other firms and began operating his own investment business, PFG. By 2009, the operation was expanding rapidly. Eventually, around 115 investors placed approximately $51 million into PFG and related funds, including the Montgomery Growth Fund. Price told them the goal was to generate steady, relatively low-risk returns. In reality, their money was being placed into stocks, options, real estate, and even farming projects in South America. The risks were far greater than many of his clients had been led to believe. At first, no one had much reason to become suspicious. Their account statements showed profits. And when investors asked to withdraw money, those requests could usually be fulfilled. Price seemed to have everything needed to inspire confidence. He was a family man, a former pastor with years of ministry experience, a supporter of missionary work in Venezuela, and a licensed financial advisor with experience at major institutions. But around 2009, things began to change. Stock and options trades repeatedly failed. Some real estate investments also failed to produce the expected returns. Losses began piling up. Price now faced a choice: tell his clients the truth, or hide what had happened. He chose to hide it. Price began falsifying investment returns and account information. The numbers his clients saw increasingly had little connection to the money that actually remained in their accounts. He later admitted to investigators that he had concealed approximately $20 million to $23 million in investor losses. And while the hole inside PFG continued to grow, Price turned his attention toward something even bigger. In the small town of Ely, Georgia, a struggling community bank caught Price's attention, Montgomery Bank and Trust. The bank had been badly weakened after the financial crisis and desperately needed new capital. Without it, the institution might not survive. In 2010, Price convinced 40 PFG clients to participate in an acquisition. Through PFG Holding Company, he raised approximately $10 million. Bank employees and local residents contributed another $4 million. Altogether, approximately $14 million in new capital was injected into the bank. After the deal was completed, Price became a major shareholder and joined the bank's board. For a time, he was viewed locally as the man who had helped save a struggling community bank. The plan seemed straightforward: stabilize the bank, help it recover, then profit from its turnaround. But by 2011, the situation was worse than expected. The new capital hadn't solved the bank's underlying problems. It was still carrying large amounts of troubled debt, and Price's own investment was now at risk. So he proposed another solution. Price offered to personally manage part of the bank's money, claiming he would place it into safe U.S. Treasury securities. The bank initially authorized a transfer of $5 million. Price told bank officials that the money was safely held in an account with a major financial institution, but that account did not exist. Over roughly the next 18 months, Price gained control over additional bank funds. Eventually, he controlled more than $21 million. Instead of placing the money into safe government securities, he used it for high-risk trading in stocks, options, and other investments. He was trying to trade his way out of the hole. It didn't work. More than $16 million of the bank's money was lost through those trades. By this point, Price could no longer solve the problem simply by making better investments. There was only one strategy left: make the bank believe the money was still there. Between 2011 and 2012, Price was trying to keep two collapsing financial systems alive at the same time. On one side were the hidden losses suffered by PFG investors. On the other was the money taken from Montgomery Bank and Trust and lost through trading. His solution was simple: fake the numbers. Account balances and investment returns were artificially inflated. Whenever someone needed money, funds could be shifted around to keep the illusion alive. That was one reason the scheme remained hidden for so long. Investors continued seeing positive numbers in their accounts. Withdrawal requests were generally being honored, and documents provided to the bank suggested that its money remained safely invested. Price later told the FBI that he continued making risky trades because he genuinely believed he could eventually earn back everything he had lost. Instead, the losses continued to grow. New trades failed. And with every failed investment, the gap between the real accounts and the documents Price had created became wider. By 2012, the entire scheme had reached a breaking point. One serious examination of the accounts could expose everything. June 16, 2012, Price left his home in Georgia. He told his wife, Rebecca, that he was traveling to Guatemala on business. But Price never went to Guatemala. Instead, he traveled to Key West, Florida. There, he purchased a ticket for a high-speed ferry traveling from Key West to Fort Myers. Then, he boarded the boat. From that moment forward, Aubrey Lee Price disappeared. 2 days later, on June 18th, Rebecca and other family members received letters he had left behind. Only then did they begin to understand what had happened. Price described a completely different journey. He wrote that he had traveled to Key West, boarded the ferry to Fort Myers, and planned to jump into the ocean during the trip and end his life. He also left behind a 22-page document titled Confidential Confession for Regulators. Inside, Price admitted that he had created false investment returns and concealed approximately $20 million to $23 million in investor losses. By then, he had already been missing for 2 days. His disappearance was reported. The U.S. Coast Guard launched aircraft and searched along the ferry route. Investigators questioned ferry employees. They checked rental car companies around Fort Myers. They found nothing, no body, no physical evidence that he had entered the water, and no witness who could confirm seeing him jump from the ferry. Investigators then began reconstructing Price's movements before he disappeared. Credit card records confirmed that he had purchased the ferry ticket, but they also revealed another unusual purchase: diving weights. While the search continued, the financial system Price had built began collapsing. Less than 2 weeks after his disappearance, on June 27, 2012, a federal court in New York issued a warrant for his arrest. The SEC also launched its own investigation. Investigators began examining the real accounts behind PFG and the bank. For the first time, the numbers Price had hidden for years were being exposed. On July 6, 2012, just 20 days after Price disappeared, Georgia banking regulators closed Montgomery Bank and Trust. The FDIC took control. The bank Price had once been praised for helping save was gone, and Price was nowhere to be found. Price's wife and children believed he had followed through with the plan described in his letter. They believed he was dead. The FBI wasn't convinced. FBI Special Agent Ed Sutcliffe later explained that although Price's farewell letter sounded sincere, investigators didn't believe he had died. The reason was simple: there was no body, and the timing was impossible to ignore. Price had disappeared just as his financial schemes were approaching complete exposure. Investigators also knew that he had spent years deceiving the people around him. Combined with the absence of a body or a confirmed witness, the idea that Price had truly died became far less convincing to federal investigators. They also knew about his long history of missionary work in Venezuela, and shortly before his disappearance, Price had once again traveled to Venezuela, returning to the United States on June 2, 2012. The public search continued throughout the second half of 2012 and into 2013. Nothing surfaced. Eventually, Price's family petitioned a Florida court to have him officially declared dead. The court approved the request. On paper, Aubrey Lee Price no longer existed. But the FBI didn't close the case. A court ruling couldn't change the fundamental problem. There was still no body, there was still no confirmed witness, and to federal investigators, Aubrey Lee Price remained a wanted fugitive. What they didn't know was that Price was already living an entirely different life. December 31st, 2013, New Year's Eve, Glynn County, Georgia. According to news reports, an officer near Brunswick noticed a vehicle with windows that appeared to be tinted too dark. It was an ordinary traffic stop. Behind the wheel was a middle-aged man with long hair. The officer asked for identification. The driver produced a fake ID, but as police began checking the information, things didn't match. The questioning continued, and eventually the driver's real name emerged: Aubrey Lee Price. The name immediately triggered the federal wanted system. The long-haired driver sitting in front of the officers was the former bank director the FBI had been searching for nearly 18 months, the same man who claimed he had jumped from a ferry near Key West, the same man who had already been declared legally dead. Price was taken into custody. His fingerprints confirmed his identity. There had been no elaborate undercover operation, no dramatic international takedown. The 18-month search for Aubrey Lee Price ended because of an ordinary traffic stop. His family was stunned. Rebecca had believed her husband was dead. Now she discovered that Price had not only survived, he had spent the previous 18 months living under another identity. After his arrest, the FBI could finally ask him what had actually happened. After leaving the ferry, Price first escaped to Mexico. Eventually, he returned to Florida, but this wasn't the story of a financial criminal escaping overseas with millions of dollars and living in luxury. Most of the money was already gone. It had been lost through failed investments and speculative trading. Once Price returned to the United States, he couldn't openly live as Aubrey Lee Price. That name belonged to a federal fugitive, and legally, it also belonged to a dead man. So Price became someone else. He used a false identity and fake documents. He let his hair grow long, leaving behind the clean-cut appearance he once had as a pastor, financial advisor, and bank director. And in Florida, his life changed completely. Price began growing and selling marijuana. He also became involved in other drug activity. At times, he even worked as a bodyguard for workers. When authorities later searched a residence connected to him, they discovered approximately 225 marijuana plants. Investigators also found equipment used to create false identification documents, a handgun, and multiple cell phones. According to the FBI, these items were connected to marijuana and cocaine trafficking. The contrast was extraordinary. The man who had once stood in churches, led mission trips, advised investors, and sat on the board of a bank was now living under a false identity, growing marijuana and working around an entirely different world. And somehow, investigators still hadn't found him. His new life continued until the final day of 2013. In 2014, Aubrey Lee Price finally stood in federal court under his real identity. There would be no disappearing this time. Prosecutors had assembled two major cases against him. The first involved Montgomery Bank and Trust. Price had gained control over more than $21 million of the bank's money. More than $16 million was lost, and false documents were used to convince the bank that the money remained safely invested. The second involved PFG. Approximately 115 investors had placed around $51 million into Price's investment operation. Much of that money was also lost through speculative trading, while false account information concealed what had actually happened. On June 5, 2014, Price pleaded guilty in federal court in Georgia. He admitted to bank fraud, securities fraud, and wire fraud. The mystery was no longer whether Aubrey Lee Price was alive or dead. That question had finally been answered. Now there was only one question left. How much time would a man responsible for tens of millions of dollars in losses spend behind bars? On October 28, 2014, Aubrey Lee Price returned to federal court for sentencing. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison. The sentence wasn't primarily about pretending to be dead, it was about the massive fraud scheme behind his disappearance. Price was also sentenced to 5 years of supervised release, and the court ordered the forfeiture of $51 million, an amount prosecutors described as corresponding to the proceeds of his crimes. But that did not mean Price still had $51 million when he was arrested. In his 2012 confession, Price had admitted to concealing between $20 million and $23 million in investor losses. But federal prosecutors later described the broader picture. Approximately 115 investors had entrusted him with about $51 million, and Price ultimately lost almost all of that money. Of the more than $21 million taken from the bank, more than $16 million had met a similar fate. For many of his victims, the losses were devastating. Some had handed over decades of savings. Others had trusted him with their retirement money. But perhaps the most important part of this story is why so many people trusted him in the first place. It wasn't because of some brilliant sales pitch. They trusted him because they had known him for years. He had been their pastor, their children's youth pastor, the man who had led mission trips to Venezuela, and much of the money they trusted him with may never come back.